Welcome to the Whispers and Footsteps, where mysteries brew and every detail matters. I'm thrilled to have you here. Whether you're a lifelong detective fiction fan or just love a good puzzle, you've found the right place. Before we dive into today's mystery, let me know in the comments, where in the world are you tuning in from? I'd love to see how far our curious community reaches. An awkward village matter. Chapter 1. An awkward village matter. Miss Marple arrived in the village of Greystone Cross on a mild afternoon when the sun shone politely and the air carried the faint scent of cut grass and cooling earth. It was the sort of village that appeared settled in its ways, neither eager for novelty nor troubled by excitement. Its houses stood back from the narrow road with modest confidence, their hedges trimmed and their windows carefully curtained, as though each home knew exactly how much of itself ought to be seen. She had been invited for tea by an old acquaintance, Mrs. Hargreaves, who had written a letter full of neat phrases and warm assurances. Nothing in it suggested urgency. Indeed, nothing in it suggested anything at all beyond the usual small kindnesses that pass between people of similar age and habit. Miss Marple, however, had learned long ago that such letters often arrived when something in a place had gone slightly wrong. The village green lay at the centre of Greystone Cross, modest in size and bordered by a low fence that had been repaired often enough to show its age. A handful of villagers crossed it slowly, nodding to one another with the easy familiarity of people who expected to meet again tomorrow and the day after that, and for many years yet. Miss Marple paused briefly at the edge of the green. She did not appear to be studying anything in particular, yet she saw a great deal. The way two women lowered their voices as they passed a third. The way a man removed his hat a little too quickly, as though remembering something at the last moment. The way conversation seemed to shift, subtly but decisively, whenever a certain name was spoken. Mrs. Hargreaves's house stood a short distance away, respectable and well-kept, with lace curtains that admitted just enough light to suggest openness without encouraging inspection. When Miss Marple was shown into the sitting room, she was greeted with a warmth that was unmistakably sincere, though it carried with it a careful restraint. "My dear Miss Marple," Mrs. Hargreaves said, rising at once, "how good of you to come. I do hope the journey wasn't tiresome." "Not at all," Miss Marple replied pleasantly. "I find journeys rather restful. They give one time to think." Mrs. Hargreaves smiled, though the smile did not linger as long as it might have. Tea was poured promptly. Biscuits were offered with quiet efficiency. Everything proceeded exactly as expected, which was, in Miss Marple's experience, often the first sign that something was being avoided. Other guests arrived soon after. The vicar, Reverend Aldwin, entered with a mild air of concern that never quite settled into his expression. Mrs. Crowe, who assisted with parish matters, took a chair near the window and immediately began speaking about the weather. An elderly man, Mr. Bell, followed last and seated himself without comment, folding his hands carefully in his lap. Conversation flowed, but it did not wander. It moved in neat, circular patterns, returning always to safe subjects: the harvest, the condition of the road, the difficulty of finding good help these days. Miss Marple listened attentively, her eyes resting gently on each speaker in turn. She noticed that certain subjects caused a slight tightening of posture, a momentary hesitation before speech resumed. It was Mrs. Crowe who first introduced the matter, though she did so without naming it. "Well," she said lightly, stirring her tea, though it required no stirring at all, "these things do happen from time to time in a village. One must expect awkwardness, I suppose." There was a pause. It was brief, but unmistakable. Reverend Aldwin cleared his throat. "Yes," he said. "Quite. One must be charitable." Mrs. Hargreaves nodded at once. "Of course, charity and discretion, that is what matters." Miss Marple lifted her teacup and sipped slowly. "I beg your pardon," she said gently, "but I'm afraid I am at a slight disadvantage. I'm not quite sure what we are being charitable about." The effect was immediate, though subtle. Mrs. Crowe looked down at her cup. Reverend Aldwyn smiled faintly, as though hoping the subject might pass without further attention. Mrs. Hargreaves hesitated, then spoke. "It's nothing you need concern yourself with, Miss Marple," she said kindly. "Merely a misunderstanding, best left to settle quietly." "I see," Miss Marple replied. "And has it been settling quietly?" No one answered at once. Mr. Bell shifted in his chair. Mrs. Crowe glanced towards the door. At last, Mrs. Hargreaves spoke again. "It has been discussed," she said carefully, "as these things always are." Miss Marple nodded, as though that confirmed something she had already suspected. "And who," she asked mildly, "is chiefly affected by this misunderstanding?" The silence that followed was longer this time. It was broken only by the faint ticking of the clock on the mantelpiece. Finally, Reverend Aldwyn said with evident reluctance, "Miss Eleanor Whitcomb." The name settled heavily in the room. Miss Marple noticed the slight change in atmosphere at once. Mrs. Crowe pressed her lips together. Mrs. Hargreaves reached for the teapot, though it was still nearly full. "I wonder," Miss Marple said softly, "whether Miss Whitcomb herself would describe it as a misunderstanding." Mrs. Hargreaves looked troubled. "My dear Miss Marple, she is a very quiet woman, always has been. It would be unkind to trouble her further." Miss Marple smiled. "Indeed, quiet people are so often spared trouble by having decisions made on their behalf." There was a faint movement near the window. Miss Marple glanced up just in time to see a young man passing along the lane outside. He walked quickly, his head lowered, as though conscious of being observed. Mrs. Crowe followed Miss Marple's gaze and stiffened almost imperceptibly. "That," she said, a little too quickly, "is Daniel Price." Miss Marple turned back to her. "And is he involved in this awkwardness?" Mrs. Crowe hesitated, then gave a small, dismissive laugh. "Oh well, people talk. They always will." Miss Marple did not press the point. Instead, she looked towards the empty chair near the hearth. "Is Miss Whitcomb expected to join us?" she asked. Mrs. Hargreaves shook her head at once. "I thought it better not. She has been resting." "Resting," Miss Marple repeated thoughtfully. "That is often recommended." Tea continued, though the earlier ease had not returned. Miss Marple observed that whenever Miss Whitcomb's name hovered near the conversation, it was gently but firmly redirected. No one spoke ill of her, no one defended her either. It was as though she had been placed just outside the boundary of acceptable concern. When the gathering broke up, Miss Marple stepped outside with Mrs. Hargreaves. The afternoon light had softened, and the village appeared calm once more. "You must forgive us," Mrs. Hargreaves said. "Villages can be sensitive." "Yes," Miss Marple agreed. "They are very sensitive to disturbance." Mrs. Hargreaves hesitated, then added, "It will all be over soon, I expect." Miss Marple looked at her kindly. "I am sure," she said. "These matters so often are." As she walked slowly back towards her lodging, Miss Marple reflected that everyone she had met seemed quite certain of how events ought to proceed. What struck her most, however, was that no one appeared to be waiting for the truth to do so. It occurred to her, with a faint tightening of thought, that the village had already agreed upon its version of events, and that, she knew, was rarely the beginning of peace. Chapter 2. A Village at Work. Morning arrived in Greystone Cross without ceremony. Curtains were drawn back with quiet purpose, doors opened and closed with habitual care, and the village resumed its steady rhythm as though nothing had disturbed it the day before. Miss Marple observed these movements from her bedroom window, noting how little time passed between one house stirring and the next. It was not coincidence, she thought, but familiarity. People knew when to appear. She set out shortly after breakfast, walking slowly along the lane that led towards the village shops. The air was fresh and the sky clear, yet there was a faint sense of caution in the way people greeted one another. Smiles were exchanged politely, but they did not linger. Conversations were brief and purposeful, as though there were better places to be. At the baker's, Miss Marple paused to examine the loaves arranged neatly behind the glass. Mrs. Denton, who had served the village for years, looked up at once. "Good morning, miss," she said cheerfully. "What can I do for you?" Miss Marple asked for a small loaf and waited while it was wrapped. During that moment, Miss Eleanor Whitcomb entered the shop. She did so quietly, as though hoping not to be noticed, yet her arrival caused a subtle shift. Mrs. Denton hesitated, her hands slowing slightly. Another customer moved aside a little too quickly. The air changed, not sharply, but decisively. "Good morning, Miss Whitcomb," Mrs. Denton said, her voice careful. "Good morning," Eleanor replied. Miss Marple turned and looked at her properly for the first time. Eleanor Whitcomb was plainly dressed, her coat neatly buttoned, her hat set straight upon her head. There was nothing improper about her appearance. Yet she stood very still, her hands clasped, her eyes lowered slightly, as though waiting for permission to exist. Mrs. Denton served her quickly, placing the parcel on the counter without unnecessary contact. There was no unkindness in the action, merely efficiency taken too far. Eleanor paid and turned to leave. As she passed Miss Marple, she gave a small nod, uncertain but courteous. Miss Marple returned it warmly. Outside, Eleanor paused, then continued down the street at a measured pace. Miss Marple followed at a distance, careful not to appear deliberate. She noticed how Eleanor was greeted, or rather, how she was not. Heads inclined briefly. Words were exchanged, but without warmth. She was acknowledged, yet excluded. At the post office, Eleanor waited her turn while two women ahead of her discussed a parish matter. When Eleanor stepped forward, the conversation ended abruptly. "I've come for my letters," Eleanor said. The clerk retrieved them without comment. One envelope lay on the counter for a moment longer than the others before being handed over. Miss Marple, watching from behind, noted that Eleanor's fingers trembled slightly as she took it. Outside again, Eleanor hesitated, then turned suddenly. "I beg your pardon," she said. "You are staying with Mrs. Pike, are you not?" "Yes," Miss Marple replied pleasantly. "I am Miss Marple." Eleanor smiled faintly. "I am Eleanor Whitcomb." "I am pleased to meet you," Miss Marple said sincerely. There was a pause. Eleanor seemed uncertain whether to continue. "You will find Greystone Cross very settled," Eleanor said at last. "Yes," Miss Marple agreed. "I have noticed that." Eleanor's mouth tightened slightly. "People are very kind here," she said, though her tone suggested effort rather than conviction. "Kindness," Miss Marple replied gently, "takes many forms." Eleanor glanced around, then lowered her voice. "If you will excuse me," she said, "I must go on." Miss Marple watched her walk away. She noticed how Eleanor did not look back. Later that morning, Miss Marple encountered Daniel Price near the green. He stood beside the notice board, pretending to read the parish announcements, though his eyes were fixed elsewhere. When he became aware of Miss Marple's presence, he straightened slightly. "Good morning," he said. "Good morning," Miss Marple replied. "You appear very absorbed." He smiled briefly. "It's useful to know what's being posted." "Yes," Miss Marple said, One learns a great deal that way." He hesitated, then spoke again. "Villages have excellent memories, and selective ones," Miss Marple added. He regarded her with mild surprise, then nodded. "That's true." They walked together for a short distance. "Miss Whitcomb is a good woman," he said suddenly. Miss Marple looked at him. "You sound quite certain." "I am," he said. "She has been treated badly." Miss Marple did not ask how he knew this. Instead, she said, "And do you think that will change?" He shook his head. "No, not now." They parted soon after. Miss Marple watched him walk away, noting how he paused briefly at the corner of Hawthorne Road before continuing, as though measuring whether he ought to go further. That afternoon, Miss Marple paid a visit to Mrs. Hargreaves. She found her arranging flowers in the sitting room, her movements calm and assured. "I trust you slept well?" Mrs. Hargreaves said. "Very well, thank you," Miss Marple replied. "Your village rises early?" Mrs. Hargreaves smiled. "One becomes accustomed to routine." "Yes," Miss Marple said. "Routine can be most instructive." Tea was served. Conversation remained general until Miss Marple spoke again. "I met Miss Whitcomb this morning," she said lightly. Mrs. Hargreaves's hand paused briefly over the teapot. "Did you?" "Yes, she seemed unsettled." Mrs. Hargreaves sighed softly. "It is unfortunate. These situations can be very trying." "Indeed," Miss Marple agreed, "especially when one feels watched." Mrs. Hargreaves looked up. "Watched," Miss Marple smiled. "Only my impression." Mrs. Hargreaves nodded. "People mean well." "Of course," Miss Marple said. "They always do." They parted soon after. Miss Marple watched him walk away, noting how he paused briefly at the corner of Hawthorne Road before continuing, as though measuring whether he ought to go further. That afternoon, Miss Marple paid a visit to Mrs. Hargreaves. She found her arranging flowers in the sitting room, her movements calm and assured. "I trust you slept well," Mrs. Hargreaves said. "Very well, thank you," Miss Marple replied. "Your village rises early." Mrs. Hargreaves smiled. "One becomes accustomed to routine." "Yes," Miss Marple said. "Routine can be most instructive." Tea was served. Conversation remained general until Miss Marple spoke again. "I met Miss Whitcomb this morning," she said lightly. Mrs. Hargreaves's hand paused briefly over the teapot. "Did you?" "Yes, she seemed unsettled." Mrs. Hargreaves sighed softly. "It is unfortunate. These situations can be very trying." "Indeed," Miss Marple agreed, "especially when one feels watched." Mrs. Hargreaves looked up. "Watched?" Miss Marple smiled. "Only my impression." Mrs. Hargreaves nodded. "People mean well?" "Of course," Miss Marple said. "They always do." As she left the house, Miss Marple reflected on the day's encounters. The village had not been cruel. It had been precise. Each person knew their role and performed it carefully. Miss Eleanor Whitcomb was not accused nor condemned. She was simply placed outside the circle of trust. Daniel Price, she thought, occupied a different position. He was tolerated but not embraced. He knew something he ought not to know. As evening approached, Miss Marple walked once more along the green. The sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the grass. She saw Daniel again, standing near the lane that led towards Mrs. Hargreaves's house. He looked up at the windows, then turned away. Miss Marple paused, her expression thoughtful. It was becoming clear to her that the village had not merely reacted to an awkward matter. It had organized itself around it, and when villages organized themselves so carefully, she knew, it was usually because they feared what might happen if they did not. She returned to her lodging with a growing sense of unease. Whatever the truth behind the whispers, it was being contained with remarkable efficiency. And containment, Miss Marple reflected, was rarely innocent. Chapter 3. A Convenient End. There was a curious courtesy in Greystone Cross that morning. People greeted one another more carefully than usual, voices softened, movements measured. Doors were held open a moment longer, heads inclined with particular gravity. At the post office, Mrs. Denton offered condolences before any loss had been announced, then flushed faintly and changed the subject. Miss Marple accepted her letters and stepped outside, quite certain now that the village had already decided what it would soon be sorry about. The air was cool and clear, the sort of morning that usually encouraged conversation. Yet today, exchanges were brief. Words were chosen with care, as though they might later be repeated. Miss Marple walked slowly towards the green, her steps unhurried, her expression mild. Near the notice board, a small group had gathered. They stood not closely but not apart either, an arrangement that suggested both privacy and agreement. When Miss Marple approached, the group shifted instinctively, opening just enough space to include her without inviting questions. "It's a sad business," Mrs. Crowe said quietly. "Yes," Reverend Aldwyn replied. "Very sad indeed." Miss Marple looked at them gently. "I beg your pardon," she said. "What is sad?" There was a pause, not long, but telling. "Daniel Price," Mrs. Crowe said at last. "He was found this morning." "Found?" Miss Marple repeated softly. "In his lodgings," Reverend Aldwyn added quickly. "It appears he was taken ill during the night." "I see," Miss Marple said. "How unfortunate." The words were correct, the tone was not. There was relief there, subtle but unmistakable. Relief that something troublesome had reached a conclusion, relief that no further decisions would be required. Miss Marple noticed that no one asked how he had been found, or by whom. "Miss Whitcomb has been informed," Mrs. Crowe said. "I thought it best to go myself." "That was kind of you," Miss Marple replied. Mrs. Crowe nodded, though she did not look pleased by the kindness. Miss Marple walked on. The village green lay ahead, sunlit and peaceful. Children would normally have crossed it on their way to school, but today it was empty. At the far end, two women stood together, speaking in low voices. One of them glanced up, saw Miss Marple and fell silent at once. The lane leading to Daniel Price's lodging was already busy, not crowded. The village would never be so indecorous, but occupied. Doors stood open, curtains were drawn back. Mrs. Hargreaves's house, a little further along, showed signs of early activity. A window upstairs had been opened wide, as though to air the room thoroughly. Miss Marple paused at the edge of the lane. She did not attempt to approach the house. There would be time enough for that later. Instead, she watched. Mrs. Denton arrived, her apron hastily tied. Mr. Bell stood a little apart, his hands clasped behind his back, his gaze fixed on the ground. Reverend Aldwyn moved among them, offering quiet words, his voice low and steady. "It was likely the strain," someone murmured. "Yes, after everything," another replied. Miss Marple frowned slightly. Strain, she reflected, was a useful explanation. It required no further inquiry. She turned away and walked instead towards Miss Eleanor Whitcomb's cottage. Eleanor answered the door herself. She looked pale but composed. Her eyes, however, were fixed and bright, as though she had slept little. "They told you," Miss Marple said gently. "Yes," Eleanor replied. "They came very early." Miss Marple stepped inside. The room was neat, almost excessively so. A chair stood slightly out of place near the table, as though it had been moved and not returned. "I'm so sorry," Miss Marple said. Eleanor nodded. "I expected it." Miss Marple looked at her sharply. "You expected his death?" "No," Eleanor said quickly. "I expected this." She gestured vaguely towards the window, the street beyond. "They will be kinder now," she said. "They always are. Once there is nothing left to fear." Miss Marple said nothing. She did not need to. "They have already decided what it was," Eleanor continued. "They told me he was ill. He worried too much. He was sensitive." She gave a short, humorless laugh. "Sensitive men do not last long here." Miss Marple touched her arm briefly. "Did Mr. Price say anything to you yesterday?" Eleanor hesitated, then nodded. "He said he had made a mistake." "A mistake?" "He trusted the wrong people," Eleanor said, "and now he cannot correct it." Later that afternoon, the official conclusion arrived quietly. A doctor from the neighboring town confirmed that Daniel Price had suffered a sudden failure of the heart. No marks of violence, no cause for alarm. The village accepted the verdict with gratitude. Mrs. Hargreaves called upon Eleanor with a tray of beef-buns food. "You must take care of yourself now," she said kindly. "There has been quite enough upset." "Yes," Eleanor replied, "quite enough." Miss Marple observed the exchange from the corner of the room. Mrs. Hargreaves moved with confidence, her voice warm, her manner composed. She spoke of rest, of moving forward, of letting matters lie. As Mrs. Hargreaves departed, Miss Marple accompanied her to the door. "You have been very helpful," Miss Marple said. "One does what one can," Mrs. Hargreaves replied. "Yes," Miss Marple said softly. "One does." That evening, the village settled itself once more. Lights were extinguished earlier than usual. Doors were closed firmly. The day's business had been completed. Miss Marple sat quietly by her window, knitting untouched in her lap. Daniel Price's death had not shocked Greystone Cross. It had satisfied it. And that, Miss Marple knew, was the most troubling thing of all. Chapter 4. Small Inconveniences. Miss Marple did not attend Daniel Price's funeral. This was not, as some might have assumed, from indifference. On the contrary, she had found that funerals in villages often encouraged a particular kind of performance, grief arranged neatly for public approval. They were rarely the places where truth emerged. Instead, she remained at her lodging that morning, seated by the window, with her knitting laid carefully aside, watching the village prepare itself for what it believed to be a proper ending. The funeral procession passed along the lane with quiet dignity. Curtains stirred, heads inclined. Several villagers paused in their work, long enough to be seen doing so. Miss Marple noticed who remained indoors. Afterwards, Greystone Cross resumed its routine with remarkable speed. It was this speed that troubled her. By early afternoon, the shop windows had been freshly arranged. The notice board by the green displayed a neat announcement of the funeral service, already edged with sympathy. Tea was served in several houses. The village behaved as though it had completed an obligation and was now free to continue. Miss Marple rose and went out. Her first visit was to the baker's. Mrs. Denton greeted her warmly enough, though her manner retained a faint note of relief. "Such a sad thing," Mrs. Denton said as she wrapped a loaf. "Still, I suppose it's a mercy in a way, better than lingering." "Indeed," Miss Marple replied. "Did you know Mr. Price well?" Mrs. Denton hesitated, then smiled. "Oh, not particularly. He kept to himself." "Did he?" Miss Marple said mildly. "I had the impression he was often about." Mrs. Denton's smile faltered. "Well, yes, I suppose he was." Miss Marple accepted her change and moved on without comment. She had already learned what she wished. Daniel Price had been visible enough to trouble people, but never important enough to be remembered accurately. At the post office, Miss Marple encountered Mrs. Crowe, who appeared busy with correspondence. "You must be tired after yesterday," Miss Marple said kindly. Mrs. Crow stiffened almost imperceptibly. "It was, a responsibility?" "Yes," Miss Marple agreed. "You went to Miss Whitcomb very early." Mrs. Crow nodded. "It seemed the right thing to do." "And you were the first to know?" Miss Marple asked. Mrs. Crow glanced up sharply. "Well, someone had to be." "Of course," Miss Marple said. "How fortunate that you were available." Mrs. Crow flushed faintly and returned her attention to the letters. Miss Marple left the post office and walked slowly towards the lane where Daniel Price had lived. The house was quiet now, its windows shuttered, its door firmly locked. A small notice had been placed discreetly upon it, indicating that arrangements were being made. Miss Marple paused and looked up at the windows. They were closed. This struck her as odd. She had noticed the day before that at least one had been opened wide, as though for airing. The weather had not changed significantly. If anything, the air was warmer now. She knocked at the neighbouring cottage. An elderly woman answered, peering out cautiously. "Good afternoon," Miss Marple said pleasantly. "I wondered if you might help me. I am trying to remember whether Mr. Price kept his windows open at night." The woman frowned. "He was particular," she said. "Didn't like drafts." "Indeed," Miss Marple replied. "Then it would be unusual for him to open them so wide." The woman hesitated. "I suppose it would." Miss Marple thanked her and continued on her way. Later, she called upon the doctor from the neighbouring town, who happened to be visiting another patient in Greystone Cross. He greeted her with professional politeness. "Mr. Price's death was straightforward," he said readily. "No cause for suspicion." "I'm sure," Miss Marple said. "May I ask, had you treated him before?" "No," the doctor replied. "Not that I recall." "Then your conclusion was based on the circumstances?" "Yes," he said, "and his appearance." Miss Marple nodded. "You see, I have always found it remarkable how much one can learn from appearances." The doctor smiled, unaware of the faint irony. Miss Marple did not question him further. She had already learned what she needed. Daniel Price's death had been accepted because it resembled a natural one. No one had felt the need to examine it closely. That afternoon, Miss Marple visited Miss Eleanor Whitcomb. Eleanor looked calmer than she had the previous day. The tension in her posture had eased slightly, though her eyes remained watchful. "They have been very kind," Eleanor said. "Too kind, perhaps." "Yes," Miss Marple replied. "Kindness often increases when danger has passed." Eleanor studied her. "Do you think it has?" Miss Marple did not answer directly. "Did Mr. Price ever complain of his heart?" Eleanor shook her head. "No, he was strong." "Did he sleep well?" Eleanor hesitated. "Not lately. He was anxious." "About what?" Eleanor looked towards the door. "About correcting a mistake." Miss Marple leaned forward slightly. "Did he take anything for his nerves?" Eleanor frowned. "Only what Mrs. Hargreaves recommended, a mild tonic. She said it would help him rest." Miss Marple's expression remained unchanged, but something in her manner sharpened. "A tonic," she repeated. "Yes," Eleanor said. She brought it herself, said it was what she always took. Miss Marple smiled faintly. "How thoughtful." Eleanor lowered her voice. "He said it made him drowsy. Too drowsy." Miss Marple nodded slowly. "Did he stop taking it?" "No," Eleanor said. "He trusted her." Miss Marple reached out and patted Eleanor's hand gently. As she left the cottage, Miss Marple reflected that trust in villages was often extended most freely to those who expected it. That evening, Miss Marple paid a final visit to Mrs. Hargreaves. She was received warmly, as always. The sitting room was immaculate. Tea was offered at once. "You must be exhausted," Mrs. Hargreaves said. "These events do take their toll." "Yes," Miss Marple agreed, "especially when one is relied upon." Mrs. Hargreaves smiled. We all do our part. I was wondering, Miss Marple said, whether you might tell me about the tonic you recommended to Mr. Price. Mrs. Hargreaves did not hesitate. A simple herbal mixture, quite harmless. I'm sure, Miss Marple said. And you gave it to him personally? Yes, Mrs. Hargreaves replied. He seemed grateful. Miss Marple sipped her tea. Did you notice whether it made him sleep? Mrs. Hargreaves nodded. Very soundly. Miss Marple smiled. That is sometimes the trouble with sound sleep. Mrs. Hargreaves laughed lightly. You do have such curious ideas. Miss Marple returned the smile. I have always found that deaths which are very convenient tend to have been prepared for. Mrs. Hargreaves's hand paused briefly over the teacup. Do you think this death was convenient? She asked. Miss Marple met her gaze steadily. For the village? She said gently. Yes. Mrs. Hargreaves said nothing. Miss Marple rose soon after and took her leave. Outside, the village lay quiet beneath the evening sky. Lights appeared one by one. Doors were closed. Greystone Cross settled itself once more. Miss Marple walked slowly back to her lodging. Her thoughts orderly and precise. Daniel Price had not died by chance. He had been helped into it, with kindness, reassurance, and a preparation the village found easy to accept. And now, she reflected, it was time to consider who had benefited most from a death that caused so little inconvenience. Chapter 5. What was convenient? Miss Marple chose the moment with care. Villages, she had found, revealed themselves most honestly when they believed a difficulty had passed. Greystone Cross was in that state now, relieved, tidy, and faintly self-congratulatory. The funeral was over. The awkwardness had found its ending. People resumed their visits and their errands with renewed confidence, as though a mild illness had run its course. It was then that Miss Marple began to ask her questions. She started with the vicarage. Reverend Aldwyn received her in his study, a modest room lined with books that had been read often and consulted carefully. He listened attentively as Miss Marple spoke, his expression open and kindly. I have been thinking about Miss Whitcomb, Miss Marple said. She has had a difficult time. Yes, the Reverend replied, but I believe matters will improve now. Do you? Miss Marple asked gently. In what way? He hesitated. Well, the strain has lifted. Indeed, Miss Marple said. And what strain was that exactly? The Reverend frowned slightly. The situation? The one everyone preferred not to name? Miss Marple suggested. He sighed. Villages can be unkind. Unkindness, Miss Marple said, is often quite specific. Who first spoke to you about Miss Whitcomb? The Reverend looked surprised. Mrs. Hargreaves, I believe. And did she speak of Mr. Price at the same time? Yes, he said slowly. She expressed concern. She hoped the matter could be settled quietly. Settled how? Miss Marple asked. The Reverend did not answer at once. By discretion, he said at last. Miss Marple smiled. Discretion can be very persuasive. She left him soon after and walked down towards the green where Mrs. Crow was supervising a small parish arrangement. Mrs. Crow greeted her with an air of purposeful cheerfulness. We are organizing a modest gathering next week, she said. Nothing elaborate, just to remind everyone that life goes on. Yes, Miss Marple replied. Life has a remarkable way of doing that. Mrs. Crow laughed, then caught herself. Quite. I wanted to ask you something, Miss Marple said, about the day the rumours began. Mrs. Crow stiffened. Rumours? The ones that concerned Miss Whitcomb, Miss Marple continued pleasantly. You heard them early, I believe. Mrs. Crow pursed her lips. People talk. Of course, Miss Marple said, but people usually talk differently. These remarks were very similar. One might almost say rehearsed. Mrs. Crow flushed. That's quite unfair. Is it? Miss Marple asked. When I was young, gossip travelled quickly, but it rarely travelled neatly. Mrs. Crow opened her mouth, then closed it again. I only repeated what I was told. By whom? Miss Marple asked gently. Mrs. Crow's eyes flicked towards the houses beyond the green. It doesn't matter now? Miss Marple nodded. That phrase is used a great deal in this village. She did not wait for an answer. That afternoon, Miss Marple visited the bakers again. Mrs. Denton served her as before, though her manner had grown easier. You must be relieved, Miss Marple said. Mrs. Denton nodded. It was all very upsetting. Still, it's over. Yes, Miss Marple said. And do you remember when it began? Mrs. Denton frowned. Not exactly. That is interesting, Miss Marple said. Most people remember the start of an upset quite clearly. Mrs. Denton laughed nervously. Well, someone said something, and then someone else did. Someone, Miss Marple repeated, who had no difficulty remembering the details, I imagine. Mrs. Denton did not reply. Miss Marple continued her walk. She stopped to speak briefly with Mr. Bell, who was seated on a bench near the green. You knew Mr. Price, didn't you? She asked. Mrs. Denton did not reply. Miss Marple continued her walk. She stopped to speak briefly with Mr. Bell, who was seated on a bench near the green. You knew Mr. Price, didn't you? She asked. Mr. Bell nodded. Enough. Did you ever hear talk about Miss Whitcomb before Mr. Price came back to the village? Mr. Bell considered this. No, he said firmly. Not a word. And after? Yes. Miss Marple waited. It was all very sudden, Mr. Bell added. Like a door opening. Who opened it? Miss Marple asked. Mr. Bell looked at her for a long moment. Someone who knew where the handle was, he said quietly. Miss Marple thanked him and moved on. That evening she called once more upon Miss Eleanor Whitcomb. Eleanor seemed tired, but there was a steadiness about her now that had not been present before. She invited Miss Marple in without hesitation. They've stopped avoiding me, Eleanor said. Some have even been kind. Yes, Miss Marple said. Now that they believe you can do no harm. Eleanor gave a small smile. It feels very strange. Tell me, Miss Marple said, when did you first realize something was being said about you? Eleanor thought for a moment. The day after Daniel spoke to Mrs. Hargreaves. And what did he say to her? He asked for advice, Eleanor said, about a matter he had discovered. He thought she would know what to do. Miss Marple nodded. And soon after, the village began to whisper. Yes. Did the whispers mention details you had never shared? Miss Marple asked. Eleanor's eyes widened. Yes, she said. That was what frightened me. Miss Marple reached across and took her hand. Then you understand now why they were so eager to believe them. Eleanor nodded slowly. They needed me to be discredited. Precisely, Miss Marple said. Not punished, just discounted. As Miss Marple left the cottage, the pieces settled into place with quiet certainty. The rumour had not been an accident. It had been a preparation. It had given the village permission to stop listening, to accept explanations without examining them, to feel relief where they ought to have felt doubt. She walked towards Mrs. Hargreaves's house, the light fading gently around her. Mrs. Hargreaves received her with the same calm courtesy as always. Tea was offered, declined, and replaced with polite conversation. I've been speaking with several people, Miss Marple said. I'm sure, Mrs. Hargreaves replied. You do have a way of inviting confidence. Confidence is so easily given, Miss Marple said, especially when it appears to be shared. Mrs. Hargreaves smiled. Villagers thrive on that. Yes, Miss Marple agreed, and on agreement. There was a pause. "You see," Miss Marple continued, "once the rumour existed, everything else became possible. A witness could be ignored, a death could be explained, a conscience could be quieted." Mrs. Hargreaves looked at her steadily. "You make it sound very deliberate." "It was," Miss Marple said gently. Mrs. Hargreaves's expression did not change. "And what do you propose to do with this theory?" Miss Marple rose. "I propose," she said, "to say it aloud." As she stepped back into the evening, Miss Marple felt a familiar certainty. The village had protected itself with silence. Now it would have to face the sound of its own voice. Chapter 6. The matter resolved. Mrs. Hargreaves's drawing room was at its most welcoming that evening. The lamps were lit early, casting a warm, forgiving glow across the polished furniture. The curtains were drawn neatly, shutting out the village beyond as though it no longer required attention. Tea had been prepared in advance, the cups arranged with care, each handle aligned. It was the room in which decisions were usually smoothed over, misunderstandings softened, and difficult matters brought to acceptable conclusions. It was, Miss Marple thought, a room designed to make disagreement feel impolite. Mrs. Hargreaves stood near the fireplace when the others arrived, greeting each guest with quiet confidence. Reverend Aldwyn came first, looking uncertain but resigned. Mrs. Crowe followed, her lips pressed together in anticipation. Mr. Bell entered last, taking a chair near the door, his posture straight, his expression grave. Miss Eleanor Whitcomb arrived a moment later. She paused just inside the doorway, then stepped forward calmly. She did not look at Mrs. Hargreaves. Miss Marple entered last, closing the door gently behind her. "Thank you all for coming," Mrs. Hargreaves said. "I thought it best that we speak together and privately. It will help us put things to rest." "Yes," Miss Marple agreed pleasantly. "That has been the object throughout, hasn't it?" Mrs. Hargreaves smiled. "Of course." They took their seats. For a moment, no one spoke. The fire crackled softly. Outside, the village settled into its evening quiet. Miss Marple folded her hands in her lap. "I should like," she said gently, "to speak about Daniel Price." Mrs. Crowe shifted in her chair. Reverend Aldwyn lowered his gaze. "There is very little to say," Mrs. Hargreaves replied smoothly. "The doctor was quite clear." "Indeed," Miss Marple said. "He was very helpful, especially in explaining how easily one may mistake appearances for certainty." Mrs. Hargreaves tilted her head. "I'm not sure I follow." "I think you do," Miss Marple said kindly. "You always have." She turned slightly towards Eleanor. "Miss Whitcomb," she said, "would you tell us, please, what Mr. Price came to you about shortly before his death?" Eleanor hesitated, then spoke steadily. He discovered that money left for village improvements had been diverted, quietly, over time. He thought it must be a mistake at first. Mrs. Crowe inhaled sharply. "And when he realized it was not a mistake?" Miss Marple asked. "He asked Mrs. Hargreaves for advice," Eleanor continued. "He trusted her." All eyes turned to Mrs. Hargreaves. She did not flinch. "He came to me anxious," she said. "I did my best to calm him." "Yes," Miss Marple said. "You were very kind." Mrs. Hargreaves inclined her head. "And shortly after," Miss Marple went on, "a rumour began to circulate, one concerning Miss Whitcomb." Mrs. Crowe spoke quickly. "People talk. You can't stop it." "No," Miss Marple agreed. "But one can begin it." The room grew still. "Villages," Miss Marple continued, "are remarkably skilled at accepting what confirms their comfort. A scandal, you see, is very useful. It gives everyone permission not to ask inconvenient questions." Reverend Aldwyn looked troubled. "Are you suggesting—" "I am suggesting," Miss Marple said gently, "that the rumour was not an accident, it was a precaution. Mrs. Hargreaves laughed softly. "This is all very imaginative." "Yes," Miss Marple said. "Imagination is often accused when the truth is inconvenient." She turned to Mr. Bell. "You noticed something, did you not?" Mr. Bell nodded. "Daniel was worried, and then suddenly everyone knew exactly how to think of him, and of Miss Whitcomb." "Quite so," Miss Marple said. "And then came the tonic." Mrs. Hargreaves's fingers tightened around the arm of her chair. "A harmless remedy," she said. "I take it myself." "Do you?" Miss Marple asked. "And in the same quantity?" There was a pause. "Daniel became drowsy," Miss Marple continued. "Confused, vulnerable. His heart failed not from illness, but from assistance." Mrs. Crowe whispered, "You can't prove that." "No," Miss Marple said calmly, "but I don't need to." She looked around the room. "What matters," she said, "is that everyone here found Daniel's death convenient." The word settled heavily. "You were relieved," Miss Marple went on, "relieved that the awkward matter had ended, relieved that you need no longer choose between truth and comfort." Reverend Aldwyn bowed his head. Mrs. Hargreaves rose slowly to her feet. "You are an old woman," she said sharply. "You see patterns where none exist." Miss Marple looked up at her with gentle curiosity. "On the contrary," she said, "I see patterns because they exist, and because I have seen them before." Mrs. Hargreaves's composure faltered just for a moment. "You managed everything beautifully," Miss Marple continued. "You discouraged gossip while directing it. You offered kindness while removing danger. You never lied outright. You simply arranged matters so that the village would choose silence for you." Eleanor stood up. "He trusted you," she said quietly. Mrs. Hargreaves's face hardened. "Trust," she said, "is a responsibility." "Yes," Miss Marple agreed, "and you used it." The silence stretched. The fire hissed softly. At last, Mrs. Hargreaves sat down again. Her shoulders sagged slightly, as though the effort of holding them straight had finally grown tiresome. "I did what was necessary," she said, "for the village." Miss Marple nodded. "That is what people always say." The matter was reported quietly. There was no spectacle. Greystone Cross did not welcome attention. The truth was handled with the same discretion that had once concealed it. Miss Eleanor Whitcomb was left in peace at last, though peace came late and imperfectly. As Miss Marple prepared to leave the village, she paused once more at the green. Life had resumed its familiar rhythm. The hedges were trimmed, the windows curtained, everything appeared unchanged, but Miss Marple knew better. Villages, like people, could survive the truth, but they were never quite the same after hearing it. She turned away, her task complete. The awkward village matter had been resolved, not comfortably but correctly. Epilogue. Several weeks later, Greystone Cross had settled once more into its familiar habits. The hedges were trimmed, the lanes swept, and the church bells rang at the proper hours. Mrs. Hargreaves's house stood empty now, its windows shuttered, its garden left to grow as it pleased. No one spoke of it directly. Villages rarely did. Miss Eleanor Whitcomb resumed her walks across the green. People greeted her again, carefully at first, then with greater ease. Kindness returned, though it carried with it a faint self-consciousness, as though it had been examined too closely to feel entirely natural. One morning, at the baker's, Mrs. Denton began to repeat a small piece of news she had heard the evening before. She stopped halfway through the sentence, frowned, and shook her head. "Well," she said at last, "it's probably nothing." Miss Marple, preparing to leave the village that afternoon, happened to be present. She smiled to herself, paid for her loaf, and stepped outside into the mild air. It was not a great change, but it was, she thought, a beginning.
Hi everyone. So if you enjoy this video, share with your fellow mystery lovers and like this video. Thank you.